Today we have a very promising lecture by a leading global authority on democratization and authoritarianism, and we'll look at implications for international relations and so on. For the students who are here, I told you this is where comparative politics intersects with international relations. So they're not siloed, they actually are connected and enmeshed. Before we start, I would like to invite Professor Ek Tangsupvattana, the Dean of the Faculty of Political Science, to provide some welcome remarks for us.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome and good morning to all of you. It is my pleasure to open today's ISIS Public Forum on the future of democracy, what it means for China, the West, and the rest. As we know, the world around us is undergoing a major transformation. Fundamental to the change we are seeing is the battle of ideas and systems between democracy and authoritarianism. In recent years, it appears that democracy and democratization have been severely challenged by the resurgence of autocratic and authoritarian characteristics. This has happened most vividly in Western countries, where liberal democracy is supposed to be irreversible. In the United States and the European Union, we have seen the rise of right-wing populism that directly challenges liberal democratic rule. On the other hand, China, as the leading authoritarian system, has become an alternative model of political order and stability with economic growth. China is not a liberal democracy, but its system of centralized control with political stability and economic development appeals to a number of governments around the world. There is no one in the world who has more authority to address this subject than Professor Larry Diamond of Stanford University. Professor Diamond has tracked democratic and authoritarian trends around the world over the past several decades. He has written extensively and lectured widely on the subject. Today, he has some slides to show where democracy stands and what are the implications for China, the West, and the rest of countries around the world. Are we seeing the demise of liberal democracy, or is it merely in a slump waiting for future rejuvenation and comeback? His very impressive accomplishments are listed in the bio and which we have disseminated. On behalf of the organizer, I want to sincerely thank Professor Diamond for sparing time and sharing his expertise and insights with us today. After Professor Diamond's talk, we will hold a panel to examine democratization and authoritarianism in the context of Thailand and Southeast Asia, drawing a local expertise. Here we have Assistant Professor Dr. Prajak Kongkirati from Thammasat University, and Associate Professor Puangthong Pawakapan from our faculty, Chulalongkorn University, and Associate Professor Dr. Jade Donavanik from College of ASEAN Scholars, Kongkirati, and he is also the former constitutional drafter. I also would like to thank them for their time and expertise. We will not solve the world problem today, but I think we will be enriched and end up with a better understanding of where we are and where we need to go. Let me now hand the floor back to Ajahn Thitinan, and thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Look, by way of introduction, I would first say that Professor Larry Diamond is not alien to the Chula campus. He's been around here. Professor Sujit Bunmunkan just reminded me that years ago he was still a budding young scholar student looking for research ideas, examining democracies in Asia. So he was actually strolling around campus, I think in the 70s, some years ago. The last time he was here for us, I think 5 years ago, he gave a talk in a similar way on democratization, the fate of democracies. And I think in the last 5 years, there have been a lot of changes in the world, a lot of ripples and turbulence. So we will have to see what Professor Diamond have to say about that. He has a PowerPoint, it's an illuminating PowerPoint, very instructive, and he will speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then after that I'll invite our panelists to join us on a panel looking at the local Thai and Southeast Asia implications, meanings of the battle of ideas, the arena between democracy, democratization, and autocracy, authoritarianism. So please take a look at Professor Diamond's books and articles. I mean, his CV can be like a small monograph, so I don't have time to go into his background. But he's been traveling around the world, studying, examining, researching democracy, authoritarianism issues, comparative politics. Most recently, he's been in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and he's here for the week to give a lecture here at Chula, the main one, I hope, and then he'll give another lecture at NIDA. He gave one yesterday at KPI. So, Professor Diamond, the stage is yours.
Well, I really need to thank my very, very generous colleagues at Chulalongkorn University. First of all, your distinguished Dean, Professor Ake, and of course my longtime dear friend, Professor Thitinan, for this kind invitation, for your interest. I'm astonished by the turnout from your diplomatic community here in Bangkok. I think that tells you something about the concern among the democracies of the world about the state of democracy. So my talk I will try to compress because I really think the most interesting part of this morning will be the comments and the discussion. Also it's a little depressing or alarming. So maybe our colleagues, perhaps by focusing on the prospects for Thailand's return to democracy, or maybe you'll have something to say about the extraordinary breakthrough to democracy that has happened in your longtime authoritarian neighbor, Malaysia. I mean, there are a few positive things happening in the world, but the general trend is one of authoritarian deterioration, and that's what I'm going to try and explain to you. I want to highlight 6 trends that have been happening in the world. You can see them here. We've been in a democratic recession for more than a decade. This is what I've been arguing. I fear that it is now gathering steam and mutating into something far more ominous, and that is the bulk of what I'll have to say here. I want to show you that a leading element of this is the deteriorating rule of law in many of these countries, and to make a distinction between electoral democracy and liberal democracy, because in the end it's liberal democracy with a strong rule of law that we want and that is much more likely to survive than a mere electoral democracy. One of the reasons why we're concerned is because we have a new wave of illiberal populism sweeping through much of the European Union and the United States, and this has some poses some challenges to the quality and stability of democracy in countries that we had assumed we would never have to worry about as democracies. The fourth dimension is rising polarization that's being magnified by social media. The fifth dimension is the international one. It's a very different world than the 10 to 15 years that followed the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the demise of the Soviet Union, and the reality of there being a lone superpower that was a liberal democratic superpower. It wasn't angelic. I never, seek to apologize for, I think, the excesses and sometimes hubris of my own country. You should know that I was very critical of the US invasion of Iraq, which I think was a very important precipitant of the democratic recession in the world. But now we have a different world. We've got two superpowers and another former superpower that's trying to recover some of its former glory. And these are not engaging the world in a benign and democratic way. They are seeking to project authoritarian values and undermine democratic institutions. Many countries are kind of living in the shadow of this. One country is sandwiched in between them and faces a particularly interesting challenge. Finally, I want to talk about the decay of democratic values and the decline or erosion of democracy in the US and Europe, but I'll have to do that much more briefly. Let me just note that it's not only electoral democracy we want. Electoral democracy with strong competition, truly free and fair elections, real popular sovereignty, is only one of three dimensions of a high-quality democracy. And a good democracy is one that also does a good job of protecting individual freedom and group rights and has at least a decent level of social and economic equality, and crucially, a civic culture. It is very hard to sustain democracy unless you have a culture of mutual respect, mutual tolerance, and mutual restraint between competing political parties. I think I hardly need to make this point in Thailand, which has repeatedly suffered democratic breakdowns, in part because of the weakness of this kind of culture, the paucity of it among contending political forces. But unless you have some restraints on political ambitions and some commitment to the rules of the game and to norms of democratic conduct above and beyond the pursuit of power, you're not going to have a high-quality democracy. You're likely to have a much more contentious and degraded democracy. And that is a democracy that history tells us will be at much higher risk of failure. The third dimension is good governance or good government in the kind of Platonic Republican ideal of a government that governs in the interest of all of the people and not in the interest of themselves. And it's precisely when the politicians are seen to be a corrupt class unto themselves that are exploiting policies, taking bribes, accumulating wealth, while the public interest is not being advanced. Public infrastructure is not being built. Public goods are not being delivered. That's when democracy is at its most vulnerable. And in particular, when a country is at risk of seeing the rise of a populist demagogue who says, the whole political system is corrupt, and elect me and I will clean it up. This is part of the challenge that Brazil faces now in the aftermath of this sweeping scandal that has engulfed much of the Brazilian political class, the Lava Jato corruption scandal. So this third pillar rests on a strong rule of law, true judicial independence, and very strong institutions of horizontal accountability, independent institutions, monitoring institutions, auditing agencies, counter-corruption commission, independent electoral commission, that seek to restrain the abuse of power and promote good governance. Thailand thought it had achieved this in 1997 with your new constitution, which was innovated in many remarkable ways to try and establish and insulate these institutions from executive abuse. And I thought Thailand had crossed an important threshold with this 1997 constitution. So much so that I wrote at one point that Thailand's on the road to, you know, a more sophisticated, deeper democracy, and the era of coups is behind Thailand. And of course, you know, that was another demonstration of the most important social law that I can share with you today, which is that political scientists are very good at predicting the past and very poor at predicting the future. So everything I say, you should take with a grain of salt. This is the slide which unfortunately has been inflicted on you, some of you more than once, of trends in democracy among states with more than 1 million population. And you see here two trend lines. The top red line is the trend line for all the democracies of the world above 1 million population. Even if they're fairly illiberal, human rights are not all that well respected. Maybe there's a certain amount of, or a serious amount of corruption. But just looking at this red line, all the democracies of the world that can choose their leaders and replace their leaders in free and fair elections, you see that the ascent of democracy was very gradual from the time of the beginning of the third wave of global democratization in 1974 through the late 1970s, the progression of democracy in Southern Europe, and then the growth of democracy in Latin America, and then the big burst after 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the spread of democracy to not only Central and Eastern Europe, other parts of the former Soviet Empire, but also to sub-Saharan Africa. By then, most of Latin America was democratic, much of Asia as well. And you can see a continued modest improvement in the extent of democracy in the world until 2005. And then beginning in 2006, this progress just comes to a halt. And you'll see this represented in a couple of other ways as well. For the last 10 or 11 years, maybe a dozen years, we've been in a period that I have called a democratic recession, in which, as you'll see in a moment, more countries have been losing freedom than gaining it. The pace of democratic breakdowns has been rising, and the whole debate about democracy has moved to a more skeptical terrain. You know, the Germans have a word that I love. I think it's a very important word to understand the nature, the intangible nature of world politics. The word is zeitgeist, spirit of the times. And for much of the period from the 1980s in the Ronald Reagan era with the promotion of democracy and then the transitions to democracy in the Philippines, in South Korea, in Taiwan, in many other countries, the burst of freedom in the former communist countries and in Africa, democracy was the spirit of the times. And The Soviet model had collapsed. Dictatorship seemed to be on the defensive morally and intellectually. That's no longer the case. The spirit of the times is the spirit of dynamic Chinese authoritarian power and expansionism, resurgent Russian power and interventionism, which I think elected the President of the United States in 2016, and a lot of talk and chatter about the China model as maybe being a better way of governing than democracy. Now, I will say, I think if you travel in Asia, you travel in Africa, you find much more interest in the China model among the leaders who'd like to be the beneficiaries of the China model by virtue of never having to face a real election again than you do among the people. But nevertheless, we're living in a different era. And it's an era which you can see the percentage of democracies among these plus 1 million states has subsided to about half of all the states. And it's not that this is a dramatic decline, it's a 6 percentage point decline. It's that it's been going on for over a decade, and it leaves a number of countries like the Philippines under President Duterte kind of tilting away from democracy. And we could see many more democratic failures in the coming years, plunging this percentage well below half if we don't have more attention to what's necessary to revive and deepen democracy, and if we don't have, I'd say, the mobilization of new energy and new common purpose among the democracies of the world in their important communities, the European Union, the NATO alliance, the informal interactions that constitute a kind of democratic network in the Asia-Pacific region, and of course, institutions that at least have some elements of democratic formal commitment in them and democratic and human rights institutions and norms, including the OAS and the African Union. The slide below this, you see, tracks the percentage of states in the world that can be said to be more or less liberal democracies, and this has declined also in the last decade, though more modestly, because it never reached a very high level to begin with. And so the two things you should take away from this slide are, first of all, the erosion after the inflection point in 2005, and second of all, the big gap between electoral democracy and liberal democracy. And if you're looking at the countries where democracy is failing, it's those countries that don't have a high quality of democracy with strong protection for judicial independence, the rule of law, human rights, and control of corruption. This is another way of seeing the democratic recession. You can see that between 1991 and 2005, in almost every one of these years, many more countries gained in freedom than declined. The ratio was often 2.5 times as many countries gaining in freedom as declined. In 2006, this just drops to a halt, and in 2007, you see kind of the reverse pattern. And each of the 11 years since then, only about half as many countries have improved their freedom score in a given year as the number that have declined. Some of you have been asking, why 2006, 2007? And I'll just say briefly, I think the Iraq War had something to do with this. It had the unfortunate effect of equating democracy promotion with the use of military force. It was a badly bungled exercise. I was on the ground there trying to help advance democracy and help write the interim constitution for Iraq. I could go on at length about how badly and arrogantly and incompetently it was managed, but I've taken a whole book to do that, so you can read my book or my article in Foreign Affairs if you want the shorter version. Then too, the world economy was starting to turn down, and we had the financial crash in 2008. And while there wasn't a wave of democratic breakdowns following the financial crash in 2008, initially what people did is throw out their incumbent governments rather than democracy itself. Over time, it took a very big toll. And particularly in the context of globalization, the displacement from trade, technological change, the displacement from automation, growing inequality, a decade now, more in many countries, where the wages, the real wages of ordinary working people, many middle-class people have been flat, they haven't been improving, but the incomes of the top 5% have been increasing stratospherically. So you've got this massive increase in inequality which has been feeding this populist resentment. So all of these things have been converging to create, over the last decade, a much more challenging period for democracy. And as a result, and this is why I now worry that the immediate future of democracy, I'm a natural optimist, so I'm much more optimistic about the long run. I don't think China is going to remain a communist authoritarian country in the medium to long run. I think 30 years from now, 20, I can't, I don't have a crystal ball, and I just told you, political scientists are lousy predictors. But China is going to change as a result of economic development. But the problem is, what is an increasingly communist, now nearly a totalitarian Chinese authoritarian state going to do in the interim until it faces some existential crisis? So the reality now is that liberal democracies are, many of them, not all, I'll show you a slide, becoming less liberal. Their quality of democracy is deteriorating. Some of them are becoming more susceptible to the siren song of illiberal populism. Many electoral democracies are at risk. I mentioned the Philippines. Brazil is going to have an extremely consequential election this fall in which a right-wing illiberal politician, Senator Jair or Congressman Jair Bolsonaro, who's a kind of open sympathizer of the last military dictatorship in Brazil, is now the leading candidate to be the next president of Brazil. We've had breakdowns of democracy for the first time in a European Union country, Hungary, in a country that at one point was trying to enter the European Union, Turkey, which has become an extremely repressive state. You know about the coup in Thailand. You should have no illusions about what's happening in Bangladesh now. It's become an extremely authoritarian state under Sheikh Hasina's government, and really a very tragic strangulation of democracy there. Then you've got what I call the competitive authoritarian regimes. They're not democracies, but they've got more opposition and dissent, more space for civil society. Malaysia was an example of this for 6 decades. You did get a transition, I think, to democracy in Malaysia, we'll see. But many of these countries close to home here, Cambodia, further away, Uganda, they're no longer even competitive. I mean, Hun Sen decided he was done with political opposition. He now has, out of the 125 seats in the Cambodian parliament, 125. And the poor opposition has been jailed or hounded into exile, and Cambodia is a republic of fear. And this is kind of the trend line now in a lot of regimes that at least had some political pluralism. There's none at all. And Russia, China, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia have become even more repressive than they used to be. Then we have the phenomenon of a rising pace of democratic breakdowns. The rate of failure of democracy, if you divide the third way, global democratization, into 4 roughly 10-year periods, the failure rate was about 1 in 6 in the first decade. It declined to around 10% or less in the second 2 decades. And now in the last decade, it's back to 1 in 6 and could rise much, much higher if we see a lot of these fragile, illiberal democracies tipping over into authoritarianism. It's very rare these days for democracy to die via military coup or via the mechanism you probably remember, Mr. Ambassador, of President Fujimori's declaration, closing down the Congress, banning opposition parties, and implementing what they call in Latin America an autogolpe, a self-coup. This doesn't get declared in that way anymore. It's now a very subtle and incremental process where the elected leader puts his hands on the throat of the media, of civil society, of the universities, of the business community, and just gradually squeezes and squeezes until, you know, the patient stops breathing and there's no more real political pluralism. This is what happened in Turkey over about a 10, 12-year period until you got to 2013, 2014, 2015, when I think you could say, even before the attempted coup in Turkey, the life had been squeezed out of electoral democracy in Turkey. I would argue the same thing has happened, maybe with a lighter touch, but the impact has been the same in Hungary. So democracy has been breaking down because it has not been governing well, and it's had a very low quality. You've had a weak rule of law that has not been able to protect human rights or limit corruption or constrain the efforts of elected executives to enlarge and aggrandize their power. You've had severe polarization, something deeply and painfully known to this country, around political party identities and sometimes the regional and other identity divisions behind those party affiliations. Political institutions have been very weak, parties, parliaments, and sometimes the state itself. And the result has been bad governance, either weak economic performance, or maybe you get economic growth, but it's very poorly distributed, and much of it is, frankly, ripped off by and captured by crony capitalists and the ruling party. This isn't what people sign up for when they want democracy. When they want democracy, they want good governance. And the minimum condition that people expect of democracy is that it will be democratic, that the politicians who are elected will observe the law, be restrained in their behavior, and govern in the public interest. And when this doesn't happen, people lose faith in democracy. And then you've got the international environment of rising Chinese power, which is penetrating through what we call sharp power methods in many of the democracies of the world, including our own in the United States, to subvert our institutions and silence criticism of China. You've got Russia intervening. I've already made known my view of the extent of their impact on the American election in 2018. They're doing it all over again. Now, as we sit here, Facebook and Twitter can't keep up with the proliferation of fake accounts, many of them from the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, trying to stir up our politics and manipulate our elections all over again. And of course, it's happened in Ukraine, and it happened in Brexit. It might have made the difference in the Brexit vote. He's been funneling money, Putin, to the National Front populist party in France, and so on and so forth. And this is happening at a time when there's been another evolution, a product of globalization, a very dark product that has been also creating a very unfavorable context. And that's the rise of kleptocracy. Kleptocracy, as we are articulating and studying it now, including by the very excellent Kleptocracy Initiative at the Hudson Institute, is not just extreme predatory corruption. It is the deep international complicity in that corruption, whereby rulers who are looting their countries then send their money to Europe, to the United States. Well, first it might go to Panama or the Cayman Islands. It gets laundered there through front companies, and then it enters the United States, our property markets, our banking system. They then parlay that ultimately into citizenship in some of these European and countries, and the US and so on, even Canada. And this is facilitating plunder in the countries of origin and the corruption of our own democratic order in the advanced industrial democracies. I list here American complacency, that's part of the subtitle of my forthcoming book, because we've got to decide, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to push back on this or not? You see a little bit of a pushback now on China, which I think in its broad context, many people in Asia are welcoming. But in this administration, we're not seeing enough of a pushback either on Russia or on kleptocracy. And of course, Russia is the leading kleptocracy in the world. I'll just show you a couple of slides that make my point about the rule of law. If you look at the Freedom House scales of political rights and civil liberties, you can break these into three components, and you see that in every region of the world, the scale of transparency and the rule of law lags behind the scales of civil liberties, which is the blue line, and political rights, the red line. And in Africa, it's transparency and the rule of law that's been deteriorating the most. This is the average for Asia, where the transparency scores on average have not varied very much, but you can see they rank well below the scores for political rights and civil liberties. And this is the pattern in every region of the world. Let me come now briefly to the populism element and note the key features of populism and then the illiberal element of it. Populism is very anti-elitist. It seeks to take all this frustration about people and their declining life prospects, their resentments, their fears and frustrations, and say it's the fault of all the elites, the wealthy people on Wall Street, so you can have a left-wing version of it, the knowledge elite who've been treating the working class so arrogantly, welcoming immigration. Immigrants are, causing crime, stealing jobs. This is Trump's language. It's anti-institutionalist. It turns established institutions on their heads and often wipes them away. It can decimate the party system. It's anti-pluralist. It doesn't really fully accept the legitimacy of competition and difference. It has hegemonic tendencies to be the one true legitimate representative of the deserving people against all these undeserving elites. And so you get a very kind of direct plebiscitary conception of democracy, the relationship between the ruler and the true people in a very kind of adoring and unquestioning commitment to that leader who says, the country's falling apart and I alone can fix it. And of course, that's a quote from a famous politician who was elected president of his country in 2016. And then, this gets grafted on in the contemporary era to two other very dangerous dimensions. The deserving people are the ones who represent the majority of the country. The undeserving people are the immigrants or ethnic minorities or the Rohingya Muslims in Burma, or maybe Muslims altogether in Burma or India or wherever. And this is very dangerous stuff when you start tagging on these resentments and creating an ethnic or religious or deep identity aspect to it. And it can also be very dangerous even when it just takes a ultra-nationalist course, because this is how wars get started, and not just trade wars. So now coming to the social media point, I think you, I have discovered, are well familiar with this problem in Thailand. It's not just a problem for the US and Europe. It's increasingly a global problem in which people get on social media, they get into these social media filter bubbles where they live in a world where they're communicating with people who agree with them and trashing everyone who disagrees with them. And this stuff goes viral, and the more extreme and outrageous it is, the more viral it goes. And the problem with these social media companies is that their business model is to addict you to their site, keep you on it as long as possible. And so stuff that is infuriating, alluring, outrageous, and extreme is what is good for business on social media. It drives people to their sites, but it's not good for democracy. And so if we don't find some ways of building a more democratic culture online as well as offline, and regulating the most extreme, vile, demonstrably fake, manipulative, and deliberately, violence inciting tweets and social media posts, democracy is going to be at increasing risk. Then we have the authoritarian power surge in several respects. First of all, as I said, the autocracies of the world are becoming much more authoritarian. If you doubt that, just Google social credit system in China, or read my article about China's rising surveillance state in the Atlantic a few months ago. This is very dangerous stuff. It's not just that Xi Jinping has reversed a long trend toward political institutionalization within the framework of communist one-party rule, and then eliminated term limits, and seems to be moving to make himself the strongest and most personal and dominating ruler in China since Mao Zedong. It's that China is constructing a really vast and comprehensive Orwellian surveillance state, which represents, an unprecedented threat to human freedom. It may not be as brutal as the Maoist era or Stalin or Hitler, but the technical sophistication of it has no precedent in the history of human civilization. And it's starting to export a lot of these monitoring, facial recognition, photo surveillance, and internet's filtration techniques to other authoritarian countries. And then you've also got the growing coercion of Russia, which has, now broken the precedent of 70 years in the post-World War II era in Europe, where you didn't have boundaries being altered by force, and just went in and took Crimea, and has been waging an undeclared war in eastern Ukraine. Believe me, a lot of countries on the border of Russia are now quaking in legitimate fear, particularly the Baltic states, as you get military overflights, naval reconnaissance, military probing on the ground, and a lot of very dangerous stuff. I'm not going to go into the Russian information war on American democracy. I've already referred to that, but it isn't ending. It's a very dangerous thing. It's being visited on other countries as well. The other element of this I want to note is China's growing power projection, sharp power projection, as its influence operations penetrate deeply into the media, the civil society, the philanthropy, the think tanks, the cultural products, and the technology flows of the United States and other democratic societies. You've got a situation now on many American campuses, not to mention Australian and so on, where overseas Chinese students do not have intellectual or academic freedom. They're monitored in what they say and do, where they go. Events that might not please the Chinese Communist Party, if they are taking note of what happened in Tiananmen Square on June 4th of 1989, or raising concerns about the prosecution of human rights lawyers in China, or Xinjiang, or Tibet, or anything they don't like, gets a protest from the Chinese Students and Scholars Association at the direction and with the funding of the local Chinese consulate and embassy. And I don't think democracies can allow this. If you haven't read Clive Hamilton's book about what's been happening in Australia, Silent Invasion, I strongly recommend you do so. You're vulnerable too. You're on the Chinese periphery here. And we published a series of articles, by the way, I have a copy for you, in the April 2018 Journal of Democracy, detailing these Chinese influence operations throughout the world, in Singapore, in Central and Eastern Europe, in Latin America, and other democracies, Australia and New Zealand included. So is this domination? Is it hegemony? Professor Titinan thinks it's hierarchy. Whatever it is, it's a long and authoritarian shadow that's being cast over the Asia-Pacific region. Finally, I'll just note the downward trend in our own democracy in the United States, and you've got some other advanced industrial democracies where the quality of democracy has been declining. This is the 0 to 100 scale of the Freedom House political rights and civil liberties, and you can see in the thick red line that the United States has declined the most among these established democracies, and the Economist Intelligence Unit shows a similar decline. We have some erosion in support for democracy that we see particularly among the young in Europe and the United States, and just a general sense of, democracy not being something that we are as proud of and that have as deep and unquestioning a faith in as we used to have, and a little bit more willingness to consider authoritarian options. 25% in the US. In some polls earlier it was higher. People saying, yeah, they like the idea of a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Congress and elections. Well, finally, what's causing this? I've referred to some of the internal causes economically. I would also mention rising immigration in the US and in Europe is stressing many of our societies. We are at historic highs in terms of the percentage of foreign-born of our societies in the United States and Germany and Britain and Sweden and a number of other countries. And, this is easily demonized and exploited by opportunistic politicians. Or if you're losing your job or you think your kids' incomes and life prospects are not going to be as good as yours were, you look for a scapegoat. You look around for someone that you might be able to blame it on. And immigrants are always vulnerable in this sense. And then you have, I'll just leave you with this slide, the possible global causes that I think are contributing to this in terms of rising refugee and immigration flows, the acceleration of globalization. Countries do feel that they're losing control of their borders and their sovereignty. And this has led to less liberal governments who are raising questions about this, want to slow the pace of globalization and go back to an earlier era when, countries didn't have to deal with these challenges, vulnerabilities, and complexity. So I'm not without hope, but I think we are in a very difficult and challenging period for democracy in the world right now. Thank you.